With effect from the 1st of January 2025, race programming in KwaZulu-Natal will follow the same classifications as those we've become accustomed to in the Western Cape. In other words, Class 5 handicaps with a net merit rating benchmark of 66, Class 4 handicaps with a net merit rating benchmark of 80, Class 3 handicaps with a net merit rating benchmark of 96, and Class 2 handicaps with a net merit rating benchmark of 112. Joining me to shed more light on this and other matters, it's my great pleasure to welcome Justin Vermaak, racing executive, and may I say, not the architect of class racing, but certainly the manner in which it's been introduced into the Western Cape.
Yeah, thank you, Graeme. It's we introduced it a good while ago now, and have had a good test run, and we adjusted the benchmarks here and there as we saw, one or two little cracks in the early system, but it's going fairly well, coupled with the stakes race program, which we'll delve into in a little bit more detail. But I'm pretty excited to get things uniform across both provinces.
So having introduced class racing, which, as I say, is not a concept unique to the Western Cape, Hong Kong, Australia, many other countries rely on very distinct class racing where the benchmarks are firm and fixed. What benefits have you seen?
Graeme, there's a few things. Firstly, from a programming perspective, it's much easier, it's much simpler when you're literally moving blocks around across distances to make sure all the horses in various merit rating bands are covered. Whereas when you get floating benchmarks, sometimes horses get left in between. So from a simplicity perspective, it works for programming and it works for betting as well. I think, as you said, it's not a new innovation. It's tried and tested at the most successful racing jurisdictions across the world and highly successful betting jurisdictions, which I think is important when you reference Hong Kong and Australia, was in Singapore as well. Very simple, simplistic, easy to understand for punters. We obviously are very dependent and find our world pool betting opportunities very important and attractive to our industry, makes a big difference. And I think it's very important that when those Asian and Australasian based bettors are playing on our world pool racing, that they can open a South African race card where most things are unfamiliar to them. At least when they open up a race card and it's not feature racing, they're seeing Class 2, Class 3, Class 4, which is something that people are very familiar with. They're able to then read the form and understand each horse's profile a lot easier. And one thing that people don't realize locally is in those jurisdictions, people use those class races for studying form more than they use any other metric. So when you've got horses that have been competing in Class 4 and it drops to Class 5, that becomes like a legit betting opportunity for people in these jurisdictions. So they're able to see our horses that they're not following on a regular basis, if they're up or down in class, and then use that to see whether they're going to have a strike or not.
And then to supplement the class handicaps, you introduced alongside various stakes races, which we've come to know as the Cape D Stakes, the Cape C Stakes, the Cape B Stakes, etc., and the Cape A Stakes. The Cape D Stakes was introduced more recently, and Cape D Stakes runs kind of alongside the Class 5 handicaps, the Class C Stakes alongside the Class 4 handicaps, etc., etc. Why did you do that?
So the stakes races are very important to assist us with a few things. Number one is increasing the field sizes in your categories and distances which would be challenged for runners usually. So the most important factor with the stakes races is that fillies get allowances. In the Western Cape, we have a trainer bench which is particularly against running fillies against colts. So therefore we have pretty much, we stretch those sex allowances to the max as per the NHA rules, much higher than in other jurisdictions. Still a bit of a challenge, but when they do run, they perform very, very well. And to use an example, we are specifically challenged here in the lower divisions and the higher divisions over ground with regards to horse populations. So we find it tough, or have found it tough before the population increases, to have filly-specific and colt-specific races over 2,000 meters in Class 4 per se. So by the introduction of the C Stakes, we were able to put on a 2,000 or a 2,4 even, mix the divisions, so fillies take on the colts with their fillies allowances, and then that allows us to actually host that race. Whereas before, if you split the sexes, both races were getting cancelled. So now the amalgamation of them into that one division helps stage the race. It also has a much wider spread than a handicap, which normally just has that 8 kilo spread. Here we spread from 61.5 down to 51.5 just to try and include more horses, which gives races a better chance of standing up.
Now, I know you've also been very firm of the view, chatting off air with you over many years, that trainers in this country should be running their maidens, not necessarily just in maiden plates, particularly the lower grade maidens, in handicaps, and greater incentive to run them in the Class D and Class C stakes.
Yeah, sure. I mean, we have a bit of a mindset where maidens must win a maiden before they enter into handicap races, which is quite unique only to us. Everywhere around the world, horses sort of get a rating, and then you find they go into Class 5 more than they go into maidens, where you're bumping horses better than you at level weight. So to use an example, you could have, there's situations where horses with like a net 60 at this time of year will be running in a maiden plate against horses with 80 to 84 ratings at this time of year in Cape Town, which is quite common, where they're carrying level weights with horses 20 pounds better than them and realistically have absolutely no chance, despite the fact they're all non-winners. Whereas the horse with the net 60 could run in a 64, our D stakes, against horses with a similar ability getting weight, and we've given them a 1 kilo allowance for doing so. So they're able to come into that sort of race very well weighted, and then because they are very well weighted, when they win, they don't throw up a very big winning rating. So they essentially can win that race and go straight into Class 5 next time. Instead of when you win a maiden, sometimes you can have a figure which is quite high, and then you find yourself on the back foot. So that's worked pretty well. It's been, we've had, I'd say at least more than half the D stakes so far in the Western Cape have actually been won by maidens. So it has been bought into a little bit. And if maidens aren't winning them, you're seeing horses 99% of the time who have run 3 unplaced starts in a maiden plate. When they go into a D stakes, they run much, much better. They're beaten 2 or 3 lengths, and then that gives the owner a little bit more drive to keep the horse in the system a little bit longer and keep the horse racing. So that's, and I think, Graeme, you also find at that level, the difference between fillies and colts is not so stark. So fillies that are getting the allowances, even in those divisions, are really well in.
So maiden fillies getting a sex allowance plus an additional 1 kilo for being a maiden. Then obviously also in these stakes races, the D stakes, the C stakes, the B stakes, etc. And you also have A stakes, which is obviously it's a Pinnacle type race, the A stakes races. Obviously the penalties are also, in terms of the conditions of the races, restricted.
Exactly. Again, to encourage participation. 6 points for winning and none for placing in most, or 2 for placing in some, just depending. And again, we've seen recently now there was a big charity mile prep where Francis Ethel beating Wings and Silver Sanctuary and fourth. Fillies, 3 of the first 4 of an open Pinnacle in that big prep race. So that's something that we challenged with trying to get across the line here. But again, we see that fillies are able to at least prep against colts at that level. And realistically, the way the horse population has gone with the reduction in the foal crop over the last few years, we don't necessarily, all jurisdictions at certain times of year when there's not raiding and mixing of the populations, it's very hard for each jurisdiction to have a Pinnacle for fillies and a Pinnacle for colts in their so-called off seasons, if that makes sense. So mixing them together is much more productive.
We've seen in big races around the world, and the Arc this year was no exception, that fillies can compete with their allowances against the boys.
Sure. I mean, the Arc is a race that's, funny enough, won quite often by fillies. And you do see at that level in the UK and in Europe that fillies champion stakes races as well. At that level, they're more than capable. And I mean, you see it in Australia. It's quite interesting. In Australia, it's an industry which is at least 8 to 10 times the size of ours in terms of pure racing. And they're obviously very juvenile focused. So you would imagine that relatively their juvenile industry is at least 10 times bigger than ours. And yet they don't have one Group 1 race for 2-year-old fillies. They mix. And like in the Slipper this year, I think fillies ran first, second, and third. And that's quite a usual occurrence. So it's a bit of a mind shift and a mind change with the way that we've done things. And there's just there's absolutely no reason why fillies can't take on the boys. I mean, when we do see it at the top level, they perform with distinction.